by Vivek Gupta, partner at Deloitte India. Mr. Gupta, afternoon and thank you so much for taking your time out and joining us. There is a lot of buzz in the town, especially with respect to how the taxation has become more complex for buyback and that it is not beneficial for retail shareholders, especially the ones who are in the higher tax bracket. What will your interpretation to this be, and also help us understand how does taxation for buyback differ for individual shareholders, domestic retail shareholders versus FPIs?
Two things, Shisha. First of all, I think the move in from October 1, 2024 to change the taxation of buyback from capital gains tax or buyback distribution tax to uh, to a tax in the hands of the shareholder is occasioned by the fact that the government sees buybacks as nothing but a distribution of profits. So the government says the company made profits. Those profits could have been paid to the shareholders by way of dividend, but now they are being paid through a different mechanism. They're being paid through a buyback. There is no reason for us to fundamentally differentiate between the two cash flows, and we will tax these buyback as dividend in the hands of the shareholder, not as a buyback distribution tax, which was the pre-24 position in the hands of the company. So that is the conceptual principle. Now, what this means and what this translates to is as follows. Insofar as a resident individual retail shareholder is concerned, as you very correctly pointed out, he or she will have to pay tax based on his or her individual slab rate. So if I'm on the 30% slab and there is surcharge on it, and therefore net effective tax to me is 36%, 35.88%, I will effectively pay tax on the dividend at 35.88%. As opposed to pre-24, I would have paid tax at 20% plus surcharge, because the company would have defrayed that tax. In the hands of the individual shareholder, the buyback proceeds would have been tax-free, and the company would have defrayed a buyback distribution tax pre-2024. So the retail shareholder, anyone who is at an effective tax rate of more than 23%, stands to lose when he pays tax at the individual tax slab. So that is point one. Now, in the hands of a foreign investor too, the taxability will be exactly like dividend. The only factor that changes there is a foreign shareholder often comes in from a country where India has a treaty with that country. And therefore, the treaty tax rate for dividend may be different. Different treaties have tax rates which tax dividend at anywhere between 5 and 20%. Our domestic tax rate being 20%, 5 and 20%. So for the FPIs, or what you call the foreign shareholders, their effective taxation will be determined by the treaty rate that they enjoy for taxation of dividends. And therefore to them, since their equivalent of slab rate, which is their treaty rate, is not as high as 36%, they are okay with buyback proceeds being distributed and taxed in the way that they're being currently taxed.
Understood. So that's as far as Indian residents versus FPIs are concerned. But I understand the thought process that the government is working with when making these rules. And but Mr. Gupta, don't you think it would have been more appropriate to consider the net amount, which is the sale consideration minus the cost of acquisition, as taxable, instead of considering one part as dividend income and the other as capital loss, which can perhaps not be adjusted in the same year if the person does not have any corresponding capital gains?
Right. So what could happen is I may hold a share of a company. I may hold no other capital asset. I may transfer, I may sell out all the shares through a buyback. I will be left with having the gross proceeds taxed as dividend, and I will be left with, as you explained, a capital loss representing the cost of my shares. This capital loss, of course, can be set off against any capital gains that I may make in future for an 8-year period. But this capital loss has resulted in my hands. To that extent, taxing the gross amount of the buyback proceeds in my hands does not give me the benefit of the cost that I incurred for buying that share. But compare this with dividend. Even if you were to get a dividend, the gross amount of dividend is taxable in your hands. There is no set off against the cost of the shares, etc. Now, the government's viewpoint is that buyback is nothing but dividend. And therefore, the natural corollary of that is that if buyback is nothing but dividend, they must tax the gross proceeds. And in order that, because the share doesn't exist, they have to give us a capital loss, which is why the law is written up the way it is. There are some countries in the world which follows a similar pattern, except that they allow some degree of cost offset. Even if we go to our pre-24 law, the buyback distribution tax used to be paid on the gross proceeds less the face value of the share. So I may have bought the shares at a high price, but they used to allow a set off of the face value of the shares. So that was also not a perfect situation insofar as the shareholder was concerned. there
Understood.
will be there will be some imperfection that will always arise depending on how you classify this. If you classify this as dividend, unless you follow a complicated capital proration formula, I think the UK does it in some form, Netherlands does it in some form. We could follow that, but the government chose to say, I'll keep the law simple. I'll just tax everything at gross proceeds,
Right.
and then I'll give you a set off of the cost.
Right, we understand that point. And Mr. Gupta, thank you so much for taking your time out and helping our viewers understand how complex the issue is, and perhaps it can be solved very easily. Thank you so much for taking your time out and joining us here today.